The dust hadn't settled from his horse's hooves when Thomas Garrett rode into Clearwater Springs that bitter October morning, looking like a man who had lost everything worth losing. His shoulders carried the weight of defeat. His eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who had buried his dreams alongside whatever graves he'd left behind. The townspeople recognized the look. They'd seen it before on men who'd gambled away their ranches, lost their families to disease or violence, or simply discovered that the frontier had taken more from them than they'd ever imagined giving. Elena Martinez pressed her face against the cracked window of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, watching the stranger tie his wary horse to the hitching post outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. She had been waiting tables and scrubbing floors in this godforsaken town for 2 years, saving every penny she could scrape together, dreaming of a different life. At 24, she knew her options were limited. The decent men in Clearwater Springs were either married, too young, or too set in their ways to consider taking on a woman with no family and questionable virtue. The indecent ones she wouldn't have for all the gold in California. But this man was different. She could see it in the careful way he moved, like someone who had once had something precious and learned too late how fragile it could be. His clothes were good quality but worn, his horse well cared for despite their obvious hardships. Most telling of all was the way he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the curious stares of the townspeople. This was a man who had fallen from some height and was still learning how to live in the wreckage. Elena smoothed her plain brown dress and checked her reflection in the window glass. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her olive skin showed the effects of too much sun and hard work, but her dark eyes still held fire. She had been beautiful once, before the years of struggle had worn away the softness. Now she was handsome in the way that working women could be. Strong, featured, determined, with an intensity that either attracted men or frightened them away. She made her decision in that moment, though she couldn't have explained the impulse that drove her. Something about the stranger's defeated posture called to the desperate hope she'd been nursing like a secret flame. She grabbed her shawl and headed for the door, ignoring Mrs. Henderson's sharp question about where she thought she was going in the middle of her chores. The October air bit at her cheeks as she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. The stranger was disappearing through the batwing doors of the saloon, and Elena knew she had perhaps minutes before he settled in for a long afternoon of drinking away whatever demons had driven him to this dusty end of nowhere town. She followed him inside, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The Silver Dollar was dim and smoky, filled with the usual collection of drifters, cowboys, and men who had nowhere better to be on a Tuesday afternoon. The stranger sat alone at the far end of the bar, hunched over a glass of whiskey like it contained the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Elena approached slowly, acutely aware of how the other patrons tracked her movement. Women didn't frequent the Silver Dollar, unless they were the kind of women who made their living entertaining men, and everyone knew Elena Martinez wasn't that kind of woman, which made her presence here all the more conspicuous. She slid onto the bar stool beside him, close enough that she could smell the trail dust on his clothes and see the fine lines that grief had carved around his eyes. He glanced at her with surprise and wariness, then returned his attention to his drink. "You look like a man who's lost everything," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the saloon's ambient noise. He didn't respond immediately, just took another sip of whiskey and stared at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with dessous and something that might have been tears held too long in check. "Maybe I have." Elena studied his profile, the strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard, the way his fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as he lifted his glass. "My name is Elena Martinez. I work at the boarding house down the street, Thomas Garrett." He still didn't look at her, though I suspect that won't mean much to anybody for very long. "Where are you headed, Mr. Garrett?" "Nowhere in particular." "Somewhere that ain't here, I suppose." He finally turned to face her, and she saw that his eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and achingly sad. "Why do you want to know?" Elena took a deep breath, gathering her courage like a woman preparing to jump off a cliff. The words she was about to speak would either change her life or destroy what little reputation she had left. But she had lived too long with caution, and where had it gotten her? Still scrubbing other people's floors, still sleeping alone in a narrow bed, still watching life pass by her window like a parade she'd never been invited to join. "Take me with you," she whispered, leaning close enough that only he could hear. "I can cook, I can bear you children, I can work harder than any woman you'll find, and I won't ask for more than you can give." Thomas stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "Lady, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know anything about me. I know you're hurting. I know you're alone. I know you're trying to outrun something that's probably going to catch up with you whether you're riding solo or not." Elena's voice gained strength as she spoke, years of suppressed longing pouring out in a rush. "I know what it's like to have nothing left to lose. You're crazy." But he didn't turn away, and something in his expression had shifted from wariness to a kind of desperate interest. "I got nothing to offer a woman. No ranch, no money, no prospects. Hell, I don't even know where I'm going. I don't care about any of that." Elena placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. "I've been waiting tables and washing sheets for 2 years, saving every penny, dreaming of getting out of this place. I've got $57 hidden in my room and a strong back and skills that any household needs. What I don't have is time. I'm 24 years old, Mr. Garrett. In this country, that might as well be ancient. The good men are taken and the bad ones." She shuddered slightly. "Well, let's just say I'd rather take my chances with a stranger who looks like he remembers what it means to be decent." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into his whiskey as if it might offer some guidance. When he spoke again, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear him. "I had a ranch up in Montana. 2,000 acres of the prettiest grazing land you ever saw, with a creek running right through the middle of it. Had a house I built with my own hands, planned to fill it with children someday." He paused, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to form. "Had a wife too. Sarah, she was everything good in the world." Elena waited, sensing that he needed to tell this story, maybe for the first time since whatever had happened. Favor took her last spring. One day she was laughing and talking about planting a garden, and 3 days later she was gone. His knuckles were white around his glass. After that, nothing mattered much. "I let the ranch go to hell, stopped caring about the cattle, started drinking too much. By the time I pulled myself together enough to try to save it, the bank had already decided I was too much of a risk. They foreclosed 2 months ago." "I'm sorry," Elena said, and meant it. She had never lost a love like that. But she understood the particular hollowness that came from watching your life crumble around you while you stood helpless to stop it. "So you see, Miss Martinez, I got nothing to offer you but a horse, a saddle, and whatever's left in my pockets after I finish this bottle. Any woman fool enough to tie herself to me is going to end up hungry and disappointed." Elena considered this, weighing his words against the desperation that had been growing in her chest like a tumor for the past 2 years. "Maybe," she said finally. "Or maybe 2 people with nothing left to lose might be exactly what each other needs." Thomas looked at her then, really looked, taking in the determined set of her jaw and the fire that still burned in her dark eyes, despite whatever hardships had brought her to this moment. "You're serious about this? Dead serious?" Elena's voice was steady now, filled with a conviction that surprised her. "I won't lie to you, Mr. Garrett. I'm not a young girl with romantic notions about love conquering all. I know life is hard and unfair and that most dreams don't come true. But I also know that doing nothing is its own kind of death. I've been dying slowly in this town for 2 years, and I'd rather take my chances on something uncertain than waste away waiting for a certainty that's never going to come." "What about your family, your friends?" "I don't have any family worth mentioning. As for friends," Elena shrugged, "Mrs. Henderson tolerates me because I work hard and don't cause trouble. The other women in town mostly think I'm odd for not having married already. I won't be missed." Thomas finished his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. "This is crazy, you know that. I could be a killer, a thief, a man who beats women. You don't know anything about my character. I know you loved your wife enough to fall apart when you lost her. I know you cared about your ranch enough to try to save it even when everything seemed hopeless. I know you're drinking alone instead of looking for trouble or bothering the working girls upstairs." Elena's voice softened. "And I know you haven't told me to go away, even though any sensible man would have by now." The saloon had grown quieter around them, the afternoon drinkers settling into the serious business of forgetting their troubles. Thomas signaled the bartender for another drink, then seemed to think better of it and pushed the glass away. "Where would we go?" he asked, and Elena's heart leaped at the word West, California, maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere new where nobody knows our stories and we can write different ones. She had thought about this so many times, lying awake in her narrow bed and staring at the ceiling. You know ranching, I know keeping house. There's got to be somewhere that needs people who know how to work. It won't be easy. We'd be traveling rough, sleeping under the stars more often than not. Could be dangerous too, Indians, outlaws, weather. And at the end of it all, we might not find anything better than what we're leaving behind. At least we'd be moving towards something instead of just existing. Elena's eyes blazed with sudden passion. I'd rather die trying to build something new than spend the rest of my life regretting what I was too afraid to attempt. Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. She could see him thinking, weighing possibilities, maybe imagining what it would be like to have someone beside him again instead of facing the uncertain future alone. Finally, he looked up at her with something that might have been hope struggling to life in his winter sky eyes. If we did this, and I'm not saying we will, but if we did, we'd do it right. I won't have folks saying I took advantage of a desperate woman. We'd find a preacher before we left town, make it legal and proper. Elena's breath caught in her throat. You're considering it. I'm wondering if I've finally gone completely mad, Thomas said, rubbing his face with both hands. But yes, maybe I have. You might be the first person who's made any sense to me in Monthstein. Is that a yes? It's a maybe leaning toward yes, provided you give me your word that you understand what you'd be getting into. This won't be some romantic adventure. It'll be hard traveling, uncertain prospects, and you'd be tied to a man who's got more failures behind him than successes. If you're looking for security or comfort, you'd be better off staying here and finding some shopkeeper to marry. Elena stood up, smoothing her skirt with hands that only trembled slightly. Mr. Garrett, I stopped looking for security the day I realized it was just another word for slow death. What I'm looking for is a chance to matter to someone, to build something that's mine, to wake up each morning with purpose instead of just habit. She extended her hand to him. So yes, I give you my word that I understand exactly what I'm asking for. Thomas stared at her outstretched hand for a moment, then slowly reached out and took it. His fingers were calloused and warm, the grip firm but gentle. Then I suppose we'd better go find that preacher. They were married an hour later in the small whitewashed church at the end of Main Street, with the elderly pastor and his wife serving as witnesses. Elena wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she'd been saving for some special occasion that had never seemed to arrive. Thomas had cleaned up as best he could in the barber shop, his hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaven. They stood before the altar like two people preparing to jump off a cliff together, holding hands and speaking vows that felt both impossibly weighty and strangely natural. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with surprising gentleness, and Elena felt something she had thought was dead forever stir to life in her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was hope, and that was more than she'd had in years. They spent their wedding night in Elena's small room at the boarding house, talking quietly about practical matters while carefully avoiding the deeper questions that neither was ready to answer. What they discovered was that they were compatible in the small ways that mattered for traveling companions. She was an early riser. He was methodical about preparations. Both were comfortable with silence when conversation felt forced. The next morning brought rain, a cold October downpour that turned the streets of Clearwater Springs into rivers of mud. Thomas stood at the window watching the water cascade from the boarding house eaves while Elena packed her few belongings into a worn leather satchel. Everything she owned in the world fit into that bag, and one small trunk that had belonged to her mother. A wedding dress she'd never expected to wear, 3 everyday dresses, undergarments, a winter coat, her mother's Bible, and a silver locket that contained the only photograph she had of her parents. "We could wait until the weather clears," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. They both knew that delay would only give them time to reconsider what they were doing, to let doubt creep in and poison the fragile hope they'd built between them. "Rain doesn't scare me," Elena replied, folding her nightgown with careful precision. "I've been wet before." Thomas turned from the window to study his new wife. In the gray morning light, she looked younger somehow, less worn down by the weight of unfulfilled dreams. Marriage, even a marriage born of desperation and convenience, had already changed something in her face. There was purpose there now, direction where before there had been only endurance. "Tell me about your family," he said. It occurred to him that he knew almost nothing about the woman he'd pledged to spend his life with, beyond her willingness to take enormous risks and her ability to read men like weather patterns. Elena paused in her packing, her hands stilling on a faded blue dress. "There's not much to tell. My parents died when I was 16. Cholera took them both in the same week. They were good people, hardworking. My father was a blacksmith. My mother took in sewing. They came here from Mexico when they were young, looking for the same thing we're looking for now, I suppose. A chance to build something better. Brothers, sisters. One brother, Miguel. He was 2 years older than me." Her voice grew quiet. "He died in the war. Bull Run. I got a letter from his commanding officer saying he died bravely, but I never believed that. Miguel was many things, but brave wasn't one of them. I think he was probably terrified right up until the end." Thomas felt a familiar stab of guilt. He had avoided the war entirely, claiming his ranch and his sick mother needed him more than the Union Army did. It had been true enough. His mother had died of consumption the winter before the war ended. But he'd always wondered if he was just a coward who'd found a convenient excuse to avoid fighting. "After Miguel died, there was no one left but me," Elena continued. "I tried to keep the house, tried to make a living with sewing like my mother had, but I wasn't skilled enough to compete with the other seamstresses in town. When I couldn't pay the rent anymore, Mrs. Henderson offered me work here. It was supposed to be temporary just until I could get back on my feet. That was 2 years ago. No suitors in all that time." Elena's laugh held no humor. "There were a few. Men who thought a woman alone must be desperate enough to accept any offer, no matter how insulting. Men who wanted a housekeeper they could bed without paying wages. One man, I won't speak his name, who made it clear that my Mexican blood made me unsuitable for marriage, but perfectly suitable for other arrangements." She met Thomas's eyes steadily. "I may be desperate, Mr. Garrett, but I'm not without pride. I'd rather die a spinster than live as some man's shameful secret." Thomas felt a surge of anger on her behalf, mixed with a growing respect for the woman he'd married. She had spine, this Elena Martinez Garrett. She had endured losses that would have broken weaker people and maintained her dignity in circumstances that would have crushed others. He was beginning to think he might have chosen better than he'd dared to hope. "My story's not so different from yours," he said, settling into the room's single chair. "Lost my parents young, built something from nothing, watched it all fall apart." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Sarah and I were married for 3 years. We kept trying for children, but they never came. The doctor said it might have been her, might have been me, might have been God's will. Sarah always blamed herself, though I told her 100 times it didn't matter to me. But it mattered to her. It did. She wanted babies more than anything in the world. Used to stop and talk to every child in town, always had peppermint sticks in her pockets for the little ones. When the fever took her, I think part of me was almost relieved that she wouldn't have to carry that disappointment anymore." His voice cracked slightly. "Then I hated myself for thinking that way." Elena finished her packing and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. "Maybe that's why we found each other. We both know what it's like to lose everything, but we also know what it's like to keep going anyway. Not many people understand that. Maybe so." Thomas stood and gathered his own meager belongings. A change of clothes, his shaving kit, the deed to the ranch that no longer belonged to him, and a small wooden box that contained Sarah's wedding ring and a lock of her hair. "You ready to start our new life, Mrs. Garrett?" The sound of her married name sent a thrill through Elena that she hadn't expected. Mrs. Garrett. She had begun to think she would never hear those words applied to herself. "I'm ready." They left Clearwater Springs in the rain. 2 figures hunched against the weather as their horses picked their way carefully along the muddy road. Elena had never been more than 10 miles from town in any direction, and as the familiar landmarks disappeared behind them, she felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that made her dizzy. She was really doing this. She was really leaving everything she'd ever known to follow a stranger into an uncertain future. Thomas rode slightly ahead, his shoulders set against the rain and his attention focused on the road. He had studied maps at the general store and talked to other travelers about the best routes west. California seemed like their best bet. Gold had been discovered there not too many years ago, and where there was gold, there were people who needed goods and services. A man who knew cattle and a woman who knew cooking and housekeeping ought to be able to make a living somehow. The first day was miserable. The rain never stopped, turning the road into a morass of mud that sucked at their horses' hooves and made every mile an ordeal. They stopped at midday to rest the animals and eat a cold meal of bread and cheese, huddled under the inadequate shelter of a scraggly oak tree. Elena's clothes were soaked through, her hair hanging in wet strings around her face, but she didn't complain. She had committed to this course, and she would see it through no matter what it cost her. Having second thoughts, Thomas asked, offering her a piece of jerky from his saddlebags. No, Elena replied without hesitation. You every mile, he admitted with a rueful smile. But not enough to turn back. They made camp that night in a grove of cottonwoods beside a swollen creek, stretching a tarp between two trees to create a rough shelter. Thomas built a fire while Elena unpacked their supplies, and for the first time since leaving town, they had a chance to really look at each other. They were both muddy, exhausted, and thoroughly miserable, but there was something else there too. A sense of shared purpose that hadn't existed when they were strangers in a saloon. I keep thinking this is all a dream, Elena said as she stirred beans in a pot over the fire. That I'll wake up tomorrow back in my narrow bed at the boarding house, and all of this will have been just another fantasy I invented to make the days bearable. If it's a dream, we're both having the same one, Thomas replied, checking on the horses. And I've got to say, it's the first dream I've had in months that didn't turn into a nightmare. They ate their simple meal in quiet peace, listening to the sound of raindrops tapping on the makeshift roof and the soft gurgling of a stream somewhere in the darkness. When it was time to sleep, they laid their bedrolls side by side, but kept a careful distance between them. They were now husband and wife in the eyes of the law, but still strangers in all the ways that truly mattered. Trust had to be earned, and intimacy would have to grow slowly over time, and both of them understood that without needing to say a word. Elena lay awake long after Thomas's breathing had deepened into sleep, staring up at the tarp and listening to the night sounds of the wilderness. Somewhere out there in the darkness were all the dangers Thomas had warned her about: wild animals, hostile Indians, outlaws who would think nothing of robbing and killing two travelers foolish enough to venture into the wilderness alone. But somehow, the fear that should have terrified her felt manageable now. She wasn't facing the unknown alone anymore. Whatever came, they would meet it together. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Steam rose from their damp clothes and the soggy ground as the sun climbed higher, and Elena felt her spirits lift with the clearing weather. The road ahead looked less like an ordeal and more like an adventure in the golden morning light. They made better time on the second day, covering nearly 20 miles before stopping to rest the horses. The country was opening up around them, the familiar farmland of home giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and pine. Elena had never seen landscape like this, and she found herself constantly turning in her saddle to take in new vistas that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "It's beautiful," she said during one of their rest stops, gazing out over a valley painted in autumn colors. "Different from what you're used to." Thomas agreed. "Wait until we get into the real mountains. Country out there that makes this look tame as a city park. Have you been west before?" "Once, years ago. Went to California with a cattle drive when I was younger and stupider. Swore I'd never do anything that foolish again." He smiled wryly. "Wes, I was wrong about that." They fell into a routine over the next several days. Rise before dawn, eat a quick breakfast, break camp, and ride until the horses needed rest. Stop at midday for food and water, then push on until evening brought them to another campsite beside some creek or spring. The weather held fair, and they made good progress across the increasingly wild country. Elena discovered that she was stronger than she'd known. The long days in the saddle left her sore and exhausted, but she adapted quickly to the demands of trail life. She learned to pack efficiently, to build a fire that would burn all night, to read the sky for signs of changing weather. More importantly, she learned to read Thomas, his moods, his concerns, his growing respect for her resilience. Thomas, for his part, found himself constantly surprised by his new wife's competence and good humor. He had expected complaints about the hardships, tears when the going got particularly rough, feminine vapors when they encountered the various unpleasant realities of wilderness travel. Instead, Elena met each challenge with determination and often with laughter. When her horse threw a shoe, she helped him replace it. When they ran low on water, she found a spring he had missed. When they encountered other travelers on the road, she was friendly but appropriately cautious, never giving away more information than necessary. It was on their 8th day out that they met the wagon train. They had stopped to water their horses at a creek crossing when Elena spotted the dust cloud on the eastern horizon. "Company coming?" she said, pointing toward the approaching travelers. Thomas followed her gaze and counted at least a dozen wagons, probably families heading west like themselves but traveling in the safety of numbers. As the train drew closer, he could make out the canvas tops and the wary faces of people who had been on the trail much longer than 8 days. The train's leader, a grizzled man named Captain Morrison, rode out to meet them. He looked them over with the experienced eye of someone who had seen every variety of westward traveler and could usually predict which ones would make it and which ones wouldn't. "You folks traveling alone?" he asked after the introductions were made. "We are," Thomas replied. "Headed for California?" Morrison shook his head. "That's fool's work. Traveling without protection. Country ahead gets rough and there's been Indian trouble lately. Cheyenne mostly, but some Sioux too. They're not too happy about all the wagon trains cutting through their hunting grounds." "We're making good time on our own," Thomas said, though Elena could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Time don't matter much if you're dead," Morrison replied bluntly. "We got room for 2 more if you're interested in joining up. Cost you each $10 and you'd have to keep up. We don't wait for stragglers." Thomas looked at Elena, a question in his eyes. $20 was a significant portion of their remaining money, but the captain's warning about Indian trouble had clearly shaken him. Elena could see him weighing their options, calculating risks against resources. "Can we think about it?" Elena asked. "Maybe ride with you for a day or 2 while we decide." Morrison considered this. "I suppose that would be fair. But I'll want an answer by the time we reach Fort Collins. Can't have folks riding our protection without paying their share." They joined the wagon train that afternoon, and Elena was immediately struck by the difference in their circumstances. Most of the families had been preparing for this journey for months or even years, selling their homes and businesses to finance their western migration. Their wagons were loaded with furniture, farming implements, and all the supplies necessary to establish new lives in whatever territory they chose as their destination. In contrast, Elena and Thomas carried everything they owned in their saddlebags. They had no plan beyond reaching California, no specific destination in mind, no contacts waiting for them at journey's end. For the first time since leaving Clearwater Springs, Elena felt the full weight of what they had undertaken. They weren't just traveling west. They were leaping into the void with nothing but hope and determination to break their fall. That evening, as they shared a meal with some of the other travelers, Elena listened to the conversations swirling around the campfire. These people spoke of relatives who had gone ahead, of land they intended to claim, of businesses they planned to establish. They had maps and guidebooks, letters from earlier emigrants, detailed plans for their new lives. Elena and Thomas had none of these things, and suddenly their bold adventure began to feel more like reckless foolishness. But as she watched Thomas interact with the other men, sharing his knowledge of cattle and horses, offering to help with repairs and chores, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. He was coming alive again, engaging with people in a way he hadn't been able to do since Sarah's death. The purposeless drifting that had characterized his first days as a widower was giving way to something stronger, more directed. He was remembering who he had been before grief had hollowed him out. The next morning brought the first real test of their resolve. The wagon train had been on the trail since dawn, when scouts came riding back with word that they had spotted a band of Indians watching them from a ridge about 2 miles ahead. Captain Morrison called a halt and gathered the men to discuss their options. "Could be a hunting party, could be a war party," Morrison said grimly. "No way to tell from this distance, but they're definitely tracking us, and that's never a good sign." Elena listened from beside their horses as the men debated whether to try to avoid the Indians by taking a longer route or to continue on and hope for the best. Some wanted to ford up and wait for the Indians to move on. Others argued for pushing ahead at full speed to get past them as quickly as possible. "What about the couple traveling alone?" someone asked. "They don't have a wagon to protect them if there's trouble." All eyes turned to Thomas and Elena felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. She had known intellectually that there would be dangers on the trail, but this was the first time those dangers had taken concrete form. Somewhere ahead of them, warriors were watching, deciding whether they represented a threat or an opportunity. "We can take care of ourselves," Thomas said quietly, but Elena could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Two people with rifles were no match for a determined war party, and everyone knew it. Morrison made the decision for them. "You two stick close to the wagons today. If there's trouble, we'll need every gun we can get. And I think this settles the question about whether you're joining up with us." $20 is a small price to pay for staying alive. They paid Morrison his fee and officially became members of the wagon train. But the decision felt less like a choice than a surrender to circumstances beyond their control. Elena realized that her romantic notions about striking out on their own had been naive. The frontier was not a place where individual courage and determination could overcome every obstacle. Sometimes survival required the protection that only numbers could provide. The confrontation with the Indians never materialized. The war party, if that's what it had been, disappeared sometime during the afternoon, melting back into the landscape like smoke. But the incident had changed something fundamental in Elena's understanding of their situation. They were not the bold adventurers she had imagined them to be. They were refugees, fleeing from lives that had disappointed them and hoping to find something better in unknown territory. That realization should have discouraged her, but instead it had the opposite effect. If they were refugees, then at least they were refugees together. And if their flight from disappointment led them to something better, then the cowardice of their departure would be transformed into the wisdom of their survival. The days blended together as they traveled west with the wagon train. The landscape grew more dramatic with each mile, rolling hills giving way to genuine mountains that stretched their blue, gray peaks toward a sky so big it seemed to swallow the earth. Elena had never imagined that the world could be so vast, so empty of human habitation, so indifferent to human ambitions and fears. But gradually, her terror of the wilderness began to transform into something approaching awe. There was a terrible beauty to this country, a grandeur that made her previous concerns seem petty and insignificant. What did it matter that she had no family, no established place in the world, when the world itself was so much larger than she had ever dreamed? What did it matter that her marriage was based on desperation rather than love, when love itself seemed like such a small thing compared to the immensity of the sky? Thomas, riding beside her in comfortable silence, seemed to be undergoing his own transformation. The bitterness that had characterized his first days as a widower was giving way to something that might have been acceptance. He would never stop mourning Sarah. Elena understood that, but he was learning to carry his grief without letting it crush him. He was discovering that it was possible to honor the dead without joining them in their silence. One evening, as they sat by their fire watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain air, Thomas turned to her with an expression she had never seen before, something that might have been contentment. "I keep thinking about what you said that first day," he told her, "about dying slowly being worse than taking chances on something uncertain. I think you might have been right about that." Elena stirred the coals with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "I'm still not sure I was right, but I'm glad we took the chance anyway, even if we don't find what we're looking for. Even then, at least we'll have looked for it." She met his eyes across the fire. "At least we'll have tried to build something new instead of just accepting what we were given." 3 weeks later, they reached the point where the wagon train would turn south toward California, while a smaller group continued west toward Oregon territory. Thomas and Elena faced another choice: continue with the larger group toward the gold fields of California, or strike out with the Oregon-bound families toward the fertile valleys they had heard described in such glowing terms. "Oregon's supposed to be good farming country," Thomas said as they discussed their options. "California's got the gold, but it's also got more competition for everything else. Might be easier to make a start in Oregon." Elena considered this. She had been watching the Oregon-bound families, and they seemed different from the California emigrants. Less desperate, more methodical, focused on building sustainable lives rather than striking it rich quickly. "What do you think we're better suited for? A quick fortune or a slow build?" Thomas laughed, the first genuinely happy sound she had heard from him since they'd met. "Lighty, if I was any good at quick fortunes, I wouldn't have lost my ranch in the first place. I think slow and steady might be more our speed. so they joined the smaller group heading for Oregon territory, and Elena found herself looking forward to their destination with something approaching excitement. She had heard stories about the Willamette Valley, about soil so rich that crops grew without fertilizer and winters mild enough that cattle could graze year-round. It sounded too good to be true, but then again, so had their entire journey so far. The Oregon Trail proved to be every bit as difficult as advertised. They crossed rivers that seemed determined